First, I want to apologize. The slide, our title slide, is maybe a little bit misleading. We are here indeed to talk to you about civil rights, but most of our remarks are going to be about one of our four sub-programs. We're going to talk mostly about hate crimes. Hate crimes is our top priority in our civil rights program, and I think it's most pertinent and of perhaps the greatest interest to the folks here today. So that will account for that slight change. As was mentioned, my name is Bob Tripp. I'm a supervisory special agent with the FBI, just actually literally around the block from you. I will spare you inflicting my bio on you, with one exception. I do want to commend and congratulate the Reformed history majors that identified themselves this morning. I too am part of that crowd, and there is hope after a career in the humanities. I've had several jobs in the FBI, but my current job is to supervise the Public Corruption and Civil Rights Squad here in Sacramento City. So I supervise public corruption and civil rights investigations in the 4 counties that surround where we are today. I'm also the program coordinator for public corruption and civil rights for the Sacramento division. So I've got a little bit of insight as to what's happening around the Eastern District of California in terms of those 2 programs. And Todd?
My name is Todd Pickles. I'm an assistant United States attorney. I work with Ben and some of the other folks you've heard from this morning. And the reason I'm here, in addition to some of the other crimes I prosecute, I'm a criminal prosecutor, is I'm the criminal, civil rights, and hate crimes coordinator for our office. And what that basically means is I'll either be involved in some of the civil rights and hate crimes investigations or prosecutions that occur in our office, and also then coordinate with local law enforcement, with the FBI, to make sure that if there are local investigations occurring, that we can bring any resources that the federal government might have to bear. And that can happen with respect to coordinating investigative techniques with local law enforcement, or bringing information and experts from DC, where we also have a criminal rights enforcement office in Main Justice in Washington that has a lot of expertise and resources to bear on these types of investigations. So that's the role I play in our office, and one of the reasons that we wanted to be here today is to reach out to the community to let you know what we do and to provide you a little bit of information so you have a better sense of how we can help combat any situations you're aware of where there are potential investigations or civil rights or hate crimes abuses.
Now, I think in just the brief introduction that we've given for ourselves, you're already kind of getting an idea that the FBI and the Department of Justice, and specifically the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Sacramento, we work very closely to address civil rights crimes and hate crimes in particular. It's something that I have noticed in all of the offices I've worked in. It's not one office reporting to another. It's a real partnership. So I think it's very fitting that we're here together. And what we want to do today is to kind of show you how that partnership works. We want to tell you a little bit about what each of us do, what each of our agencies do with respect to civil rights enforcement. And we want to kind of show you how we go about our jobs. We'll talk a fair bit about the tools that we use, and Todd is going to talk in some detail about some of the statutes that we enforce. Because really, for federal civil rights, it does come down to statutes. And hopefully, at the end of the day, we'll give you a little bit more of an understanding about the prevalence of hate crimes, how serious of a problem it is, and what the federal government, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office are doing to mitigate that problem. So I guess we'd like to begin with just giving a little bit of background about each of our agencies. So Todd, if you want to talk about the U.S. Attorney's Office.
So the U.S. Attorney's Office, it's located obviously here in Sacramento. We have other offices in Fresno and Bakersfield. We have criminal and civil divisions. And the civil division, although they don't have a representative here, also is involved in civil rights enforcement actions. And so that would be, if there's not a criminal component, we still have kind of a robust civil enforcement availability as well. Within our office, we have assistant United States attorneys who prosecute numerous crimes. We don't have any particular individuals that are designated solely as hate crimes prosecutors. Although I'm a coordinator, I have other crimes that I'm involved with prosecution and investigations, and there are others in our office that do so as well. However, one of the missions of the department, it's in the name, is to do justice, and part of that is ensuring that individuals in the community are free from any sort of discrimination or any kind of activity that can be classified as a hate crime. And our office takes this incredibly seriously, And I think one of the reasons we're here is to try to impart that message to you.
And in terms of the FBI, I think the reputation of my office precedes me. I think the mission of the FBI is actually fairly well known. We actually really have three missions. We have a national security mission to protect the United States from externally based threats. That mission is addressed by our counterterrorism division, our counterintelligence division, and our cyber division. We also have, of course, our law enforcement mission. This is the mission that we're most famous for. This is why we were founded back in 1908. And the FBI, of course, investigates federal crimes ranging the gamut from drug trafficking to domestic terrorism to crimes against children to civil rights crimes to public corruption. And our third mission is perhaps our least known mission, but it's still very important to us, and that's our service mission. We provide services to other law enforcement agencies. We collect statistics on crime, which is very useful, and I'm going to be sharing some of those statistics with you today. And we also provide training to other departments in the United States and indeed to other departments around the world. Turning specifically to civil rights and hate crimes issues, what is the role of the FBI in terms of that issue? Well, really our primary role is to combat civil rights crime violations and hate crimes violations through investigations. So really our way of dealing with this is to open investigations. Now you may wonder what would cause us to open an investigation. Well, as Ben said earlier, we don't just open investigations because we feel like it or there's rumors about a certain place or a certain area. We open investigations strictly based upon allegations. And that is really one of my primary jobs as supervisor of a civil rights squad. Every day I do receive allegations that somebody's civil rights have been violated and that a federal crime has been committed. So my job is to sort through all of those allegations. Many of them are frivolous, and those we usually file away. Others will be meritorious. They'll certainly be a valid complaint. But upon review, it'll be apparent to me that a federal crime has not been committed. In that case, I'll usually refer it either to a state agency, if I think a state crime has been committed, or I'll simply advise the complainant that no action can be taken. Now, so that's what we do with things that don't really involve a federal violation. But some of the things that I receive do to me appear to violate a federal civil rights law. And in those cases, I will actually assign it out either to somebody on my squad or I'll reach out to somebody in one of our satellite offices and make sure that it gets addressed. One point that I want to make is that very early on in the process, me or somebody on my team is consulting with Todd or somebody on his team. We really want to get the United States Attorney's Office on board very early on in the process. For one, the U.S. Attorney's Office is really the expert on what constitutes a violation. Based upon our experience, we think we're pretty good at it, but this is really the ultimate arbiter of what is going to be prosecuted and what is not going to be prosecuted. Additionally, we want to make sure that we're both in agreement on the strategy that we want to take. Who we're going to talk to, what kind of investigation we're going to conduct, and what kind of evidence we're going to collect. It would be most unfortunate if the FBI went on its own, conducted an investigation, and then at the end of the day, we learn that we've collected something that can't really be presented before a court. So we want to make sure that we're working together closely with the U.S. Attorney's Office.
And with respect to our side of that investigation, sometimes we actually will get complaints directly to our office. And in those situations, we'll undergo a similar evaluation as Bob just mentioned. We may undertake some initial analysis to see if we can actually move forward with a federal criminal investigation. And if we can, then often we'll reach out to FBI, indicate we've got a complaint, we'll provide it to FBI, and then we'll start working together to try to investigate the matter. Other times, we're actually getting the information from FBI or from some other law enforcement agency that has received a complaint or some other basis to think that there's been a federal civil rights violation, and so we begin to investigate at that point. We're filtering it with the understanding that ultimately we're going to make a decision. Are we going to attempt to bring federal charges, or are we going to determine that there's been some sort of violation, but there's not a federal basis to prosecute, and so we're going to try to work with local law enforcement to provide them the information and the resources they might need to pursue a local case, a state or a DA's office. Or sometimes we'll ultimately determine that there actually is no criminal violation at all. There may have been some sort of inappropriate behavior, but one that doesn't arise to any kind of crime. And so that's part of what we're doing throughout. If we are going to bring charges, then part of what we'll be doing then is working with the defense. And a lot of times, as you may or may not know, most of our cases that we do bring to prosecution resolve through plea agreements or some other resolution short of a trial. And so part of it will be working with the defense throughout the case. And if we need to, we will take the matter to trial, and we'll turn it over to a jury through the federal trial process and see where things go. But that's kind of the role we're playing. And throughout that whole process, we are working with the FBI. Primarily, there are some other federal agencies that may have some other investigative role. It's mostly the FBI. And what we're doing is we're working with them throughout that whole process to hopefully bring these cases to a just resolution. So, and I think we've touched upon this a little bit already, is the missions of the office. And our mission is to enforce federal criminal statutes, or in certain circumstances, colleagues in the civil division might be enforcing federal civil statutes. That's the limit to what we can do. When we enforce those statutes, we are enforcing them, and we take this mission very seriously. We're enforcing them as to everyone equally. We don't put our finger on the scale at the outset of the investigation. We look at the merits of each case on the facts and not predetermine or prejudge how we think the investigation is going to go. And we have within the Department of Justice as well as FBI particular expertise that we can bring to bear. I think I've already mentioned that in Washington, D.C., there's the Office of Civil Rights Enforcement, which has a civil and a criminal component. They do these cases all over the country all the time. They are subject matter experts that we can turn to here locally to get what we need to do. And then our U.S. Attorney's Office also is charged with prosecuting these very same statutes. And so we will investigate and, if necessary, bring prosecution forward to enforce all of the civil rights statutes that are available under federal law.
Let's turn now to talk a little bit about the scope of the problem, especially with respect to hate crime. You heard from an FBI agent earlier today, Nick Veripides. Nick is a great guy. He gets to roll up his sleeves and actually talk to people and do investigations. I'm a supervisor, so I don't get to have fun very much anymore, much to my disappointment. My job is more case management, prioritization, and dealing with resources. Now, because that's my job now, statistics is actually a bigger part of my life than I ever thought it would be. And I'm very concerned about assessing the levels of hate crime here in California and nationwide. Fortunately, I do have a number of resources that I can draw on. In the FBI, our Criminal Justice Information Services Division collects hate crime statistics. Here in California, the California Department of Justice also collects statistics. And those two sets of data give us a little bit of an idea of the scope of the problem that we're dealing with. Now, in terms of how many hate crimes were committed, for the year for which data is most recently available, we saw that in California, 863 hate crimes were reported to the California Department of Justice by California police departments. Nationwide, the figure is obviously much higher. 5,479 hate crimes were reported by departments. Now, take a guess. How many of these crimes do you think were motivated by an anti-religious bias? Who here thinks it's more than half? Okay, and then I'll assume everybody else thinks less than half. Actually, this is, I think, relatively surprising, given how much these issues appear in the news. Here in California, it's actually only about 15% of all reported hate crimes have an anti-religious bias. It's a little bit higher of a percentage in the United States as a whole. It's about 20%. Nevertheless, it's an interesting set of data. Now, of this number, what kind of a percentage do you think is motivated by an anti-Muslim bias? Do you think it's more than half or less than half? Who here thinks it's more than half? More than half. This is, again, very surprising to me. It's actually considerably less than half. Here in California, and this is actually 2014 data, it does take a year or two for the actual statistics to catch up with where we are. Departments reported only 21 hate crimes motivated by an anti-Muslim bias. Nationwide, the number is 178, so it's considerably less than half. I don't necessarily disagree with those percentages, but I will say this, that it is widely recognized in the FBI and indeed in the entire Department of Justice that the numbers that you see in the screen are wildly underreported. And they're underreported for a number of reasons. One, for hate crimes in general, there is a reluctance for victims to come forward and make a report to the police. In the Muslim community, this is particularly a significant problem. And I'm not sure if it's due primarily to maybe a historic lack of trust by the Muslim community toward law enforcement, a concern that we're going to turn around and turn this investigation of something that happened to the Muslim community into an investigation of the Muslim community, or if it's just simply a reluctance to involve the police at all.
My impression of the police is not fair. I mean, that's the problem. People don't have trust in police because of their misconduct. I can give you a million examples, but that's the point, you know. So when you just consider that, it doesn't make sense to approach the law enforcement because you could jeopardize your life liberty.
I have absolutely no doubt that the law enforcement agencies across the country need to do a much better job of interacting with local communities. But I hope one of the messages that we do convey is that we're trying. This office, the Sacramento FBI office, tries to reach out, and I know the FBI as a whole is trying to reach out, as the Department of Justice is trying to reach out. But you are 100% correct in recognizing that there is a problem that we all need to work on.
Recently, there are many cases of police and DMV collusion. When police, they have a mandate to give tickets to people regardless of matter. So they are supposed to give 100 tickets to every person. So the case was presented last year in the federal court, and the document is presented before the judge. Hey, you know what, police have this thing, so they are unfairly giving tickets.
Are you talking about the New York?
And the Department of Justice did nothing. And second problem is sometimes they are abusing people. They put them in jail or do something, and then they work with the DMV, and their driving license is automatically suspended.
Well,
without any acquisition.
I understand.
Let me complete that. If you don't
Sure,
mind
please.
that. So their driving license is suspended automatically, so the victim cannot do anything. And you say in United States we have right to travel, right to freedom, and those rights, they are supposed to be protected by the fair procedures that you say are guaranteed under the 14th Amendment. So.
Well, I do have to, I do want to interrupt you because I do want to just continue on.
Yeah, that's the question until then.
Well, exactly, and we can talk afterward as well. And I'm very sorry to interrupt, but I know time is limited. I do want to say that these statistics are underreporting the problem for the reason I said about people not wanting to come forward for justified or justified reasons. They're also, perhaps, I want to point out that the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office recognize that we're not talking about just 178 victims. We're talking about 178 communities that have been victimized. Hate crime just doesn't victimize one person. It takes away a sense of security from an entire community. So the figures are actually disproportionately small, and we recognize that. Now, even though there are problems with the specific numbers, the numbers are not useless because I think they're good at reflecting trends. And at least in the state of California, some of the trends are good. In the last 10 years, hate crime has gone down by 39%. That, in terms of absolute numbers, there's a big question mark, but I think the trend is accurate. Most unfortunately, though, for people in this room, the news is not good. In 2014, hate crimes with an anti-Muslim bias actually increased by 14%. We don't have data from 2015, but anecdotally, we're seeing a spike, certainly after the Paris attacks and also after the San Bernardino attack. So these trends are very troubling to us, and we take them seriously. In the FBI, I know we kind of let the secret out that we're not everywhere that you thought we were. There aren't as many of us around as we would like. But here in the FBI, we actually have 175 positions that do nothing but investigate civil rights crimes. So here in Sacramento, in headquarters city, if you report a problem, we have agents that can and do respond to hate crime allegations. We also have agents available to respond in the north, in resident agencies in Chico and Redding. In the west, we've got agents in Fairfield. In the east, we've got agents in South Lake Tahoe. And in the south, we have agents in Stockton, in Modesto, in Bakersfield, and in Fresno. So if you do report a problem, we do have resources available to respond.
And I've already touched upon this a little bit. With respect to the Department of Justice, we also have a dedicated unit that does civil rights enforcement. It's located in Washington, D.C., and they consult with all of the U.S. Attorney's offices across the country. Here in the Eastern District, we don't have any designated prosecutors. Instead, we have all prosecutors have the ability to prosecute civil rights crimes, and all of us are, in fact, obligated to prosecute any federal violation that meets certain criteria. And what we then can do is rely upon the fact that we have available to us expertise and resources from DC to augment what we need to do to proceed with respect to any of our local investigations, or to the extent we can, help with investigations that are being conducted by the state of California or local DA's offices. So there's a question of what is a hate crime, or at least how do we view a hate crime within the Department of Justice, both the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. And essentially what that is, it's any traditional crime, more or less, but then there's an added animus, an added intent that goes along with it by the defendant. And it's a bias against some particularized category. And in this particular case, what we're most interested in talking today is about other bias, including obviously skin color. There can be gender. There can be multiple factors that are taken into account by the defendant or by the individual, the perpetrator. And what we're looking at is, can we identify, in order to make it a hate crime, some kind of animus, something that it motivated the person to commit what otherwise would be a crime of arson or vandalism or violence. What takes it to the next level? And that's where, and Bob's going to mention, that's the trick, is in the investigation, isolating evidence of the intent beyond just the fact that there was some sort of crime committed.
Indeed, that is the challenge. If you compare hate crime to traditional crime, I think the challenge is very apparent. In a traditional crime like bank robbery, an FBI agent, we got two jobs. We have to establish what happened, we have to establish what the circumstances were, and we have to prove intent. Now, for example, if you walk into a bank and a teller accidentally gives you an extra $100 and you walk out, the FBI isn't going to investigate that as a bank robbery because you had no intent. Even though you walked out of that bank with money that you were not entitled to, it's not a bank robbery because there's no intent. If, however, you walk into that bank, you brandish a weapon and you have a mask, and you've got a little bag with a dollar sign on it, those are indicators that you know what you're doing is wrong. You have a mask to conceal your identity. You have a weapon to compel fear. Those are the indicators that show intent. Well, in a hate crime, we have to do those two things. We have to establish what the circumstances were, and we have to demonstrate intent. But we have this third step that Todd mentioned. We have to figure out what was the motivation for that intent. Why did you do it? We know you meant to do it, and here's what you did, but why did you do that? We have to be able to prove it was a bias crime. Well, now the question is, how do we do that? Sometimes it's not that difficult. This person quite apparently has an animus against minorities. Proving that this kind of a bias was a motivating factor in his crime is not a difficult thing to do. But it can be much more difficult than this. And in fact, if you looked at if you saw the Sacramento Bee this very morning, you got an indication that prosecuting a hate crime can be difficult. Several months ago, there was an attack against 3 men by an individual in Sacramento City. During the attack, the subject made anti-gay slurs or statements. Sacramento District Attorney's Office prosecuted that as a hate crime. It went to trial, and the jury deadlocked in significant part because the prosecution could not demonstrate to the jury's satisfaction that that bias was a motivating factor in the commission of a crime. And in fact, yesterday, I believe, the case actually pled out because the prosecutor dropped that bias part of the case and just charged it as a simple assault. So it can be difficult. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. What we'll do in the FBI, if we have a hate crime investigation that we're conducting, we'll look at what the subject said before, during, and after the attack. We'll look at tattoos. We'll look at what he has said in jail intake statements. We'll look at pertinent social media statements that the person's made, to which we're entitled to look. If we conduct a search warrant, we'll look at books in his house. We'll look at statements that he's made, letters that he's made, people that he's talked to. We'll interview friends, associates, colleagues to try to establish if bias is a motivation. It's difficult to prove, but it's not impossible.
So obviously we're talking about hate crimes, and we want to, and this has already been alluded to by Ben Wagner. That said, the First Amendment in our country guarantees certain protections, and one of them is speech, and that also means the guarantee of speech that's considered by many to be hateful. We'll talk in a little bit about when that comes into play with respect to certain potential federal criminal violations, but from the perspective of our departments, we're always cognizant of the fact that people have the right to say things that are not only unpopular, but are offensive and hateful to communities. And the fact that we, as individual prosecutors or just individuals, may find those statements offensive doesn't mean that we can then turn around and use that as a basis for prosecution. Instead, we're focusing on conduct as opposed to necessarily ideology. It plays a part because if we are going to prove a hate crime, we have to be able to tie it to some sort of animus that's based on, in this case, religion. But the fact that someone may, in and of themselves, be espousing anti-religious views isn't a basis for us to investigate or prosecute someone. And I know that can, at times, be troublesome because there are people out there who do nothing but. But we also have to be cognizant that there are other rights in play, and one of those is the First Amendment, and that's something we also take very seriously within the Department of Justice.
And if I could just add one point to this, the FBI has a manual which spells out the 10,984 things that we can and cannot do in our investigations. It's an 800-page book. We call it our Manual of Domestic Investigations Operations Guide. The number one rule in our dialogue is that the FBI will conduct no investigation based solely on the exercise of the First Amendment right. That is sacrosanct. We do not conduct investigations based solely on the expression of a First Amendment right. So it's a point I just wanted to emphasize.
So, so as to the prosecution of a case, Bob's already mentioned the techniques and the challenges that the FBI has in investigating, and certainly we're working that whole time with FBI to work with them to identify the evidence we might need. Ultimately, it's going to be our job as prosecutors, the United States Attorney's Office, and if it's a hate crime, we'll be working with Main Justice, the Office of Civil Rights Enforcement, to decide to bring a case forward. And there's a lot of factors that go into it. Certainly, we have to be aware and confident that the evidence supports what we're doing, and then we're also taking into consideration other factors, considering the defendant and whether or not this is properly a federal crime or is it more properly designated as a state or local crime. That said, if it is a hate crime, and we are aware of, we have evidence that a crime has been conducted or committed, and we also believe we have evidence that that crime was motivated by some sort of impermissible basis, religion, ethnicity, national origin, anything that would bring it into the category of a hate crime, that is something our office takes incredibly seriously. And where in other situations we may not decide that it's worthy of the resources of a federal prosecution, it's the kind of crime that would be more typically prosecuted on the state level. When it does meet those elements of a hate crime, it's something our office is very seriously going to consider and very likely to take as a federal crime as opposed to leaving it simply to the state or local jurisdictions. That said, because the federal government is limited with respect to what crimes we can actually prosecute. There are basically four main hate crime statutes that we're able to prosecute federally. The state has much broader jurisdiction. The state, basically, any of the crimes you often think of, arson, vandalism, crimes of violence, most of those are not available as federal crimes. We simply cannot prosecute them unless we can have another hook, something that ties into either the Constitution or a federal statute. And so the four statutes you see here are the basic limited statutes we're able to do, and sometimes that can cause a little bit of unhappiness in the local communities that the federal government is not doing enough. And unfortunately, sometimes it's because we're simply not able to do more than we're permitted under the statutes. We're going to talk a little bit about these. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. There's some technical elements to all of these statutes. Mostly, I just wanted to have a chance for you all to see that there are kind of what it takes to make it a federal crime as opposed to a state or local crime. And so we can kind of walk through these one by one. The first is a conspiracy against civil rights. And that's actually the broadest statute we can do federally. And what that allows us to do is if two people are coming together and they are agreeing to intimidate, threaten, oppress any person of exercising their statutory or, I should say, federal or constitutional rights, then we can prosecute. So it's a broad. It's basically it's meant to grab conduct of multiple people coming together, conspiring to violate federal civil rights. That said, it's also a challenge because we still have to prove all of those things that Bob was talking about. We have to be able to show that they're actually trying to violate someone's civil rights. They're not just trying to commit arson. They're not just trying to commit vandalism. They're doing it on the basis that someone is exercising a civil right. And so that's the broadest statute, but in some ways it can be the most difficult to pursue. Another statute we have is under 18 United States Code, Section 254, and these are the statutes that permit us to do it. It basically permits us to prosecute criminally individuals who act with either a force or a threat of force on the basis of someone's religion, race, color, or national origin. And they're doing that because someone's trying to exercise a certain federal right. And what's important here is to distinguish between a generalized threat and what's often called a true threat. And a true threat is something that's a serious communication that is an intent to commit an act or unlawful violence against a particular individual or other individuals. And this is where we talked about a few moments ago. The First Amendment protects people shouting obscenities and making slurs that are offensive to many. What makes it a true threat is when it's very focused and there's a clear intent behind the message to inflict harm upon a particular person or a particular group of individuals. It can be hard to prove, but it's also a great tool for federal criminal prosecution. It allows us to look at the hateful speech and determine, is that hateful speech crossing the line, and is it becoming something where some individual in the community or some group in the community actually may suffer some sort of harm? And if that's the case, then we have a potential criminal case. The other thing we have to do is look at what kind of harm are they espousing. And for that, there's certain constitutional and statutory rights that every citizen enjoys. And if the intent is to deprive someone of these rights, the right to attend a public school, the right to use a state facility, basically something that's available to all, such as public accommodation, the right to employment, the right to a facility in interstate commerce or transportation, the highway system is the most obvious, and the right to serve in court, the right to be a juror. If there's an intent to deprive someone of that right, and it's specific to that person or that group, then that is a federal criminal case that we will pursue, because that meets the test that we can do to bring it to bear. Another statute is one that's a little bit more recent vintage, although it's one that, although it's called the church arson statute, the definition of church is really a house of worship. And again, if there's an intent to destroy, damage, or otherwise deface property, and it's on the basis of race, color, ethnicity, or religion, then that is something that we can pursue criminally. The trick there is that we need to have some tie to some sort of interstate commerce, some sort of interstate transportation. The good news is the law is pretty broad on that. And so if we can prove, for example, that some of the implements that were used to deface a church or a house of worship cross the state line, then that gives us the basis to pursue. And the fact that it's a house of worship, a mosque, or any other sort of religious institution that's being defaced often is very strong evidence that the reason that house of worship was being defaced was because of religion. That said, there could be a situation where perhaps it was just a random incident that had nothing to do, and so that's something we take into consideration, but it's also a tool that we have to try to prosecute hate crimes on a federal level as opposed to leaving it to the state and local level. The final tool as a criminal statute is one. It's called the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. It's one of the most recent federal criminal statutes that's targeted hate crimes. It's actually motivated by somewhat recent events, one involving discrimination, well, more than that, a crime on the basis of color, and the other with respect to a crime on the basis of perceived sexual orientation. There, we can prosecute if we have injury, a bodily injury, or attempt at bodily injury on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. And then, and that's kind of a broad ability, or if it's on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identification, or disability, and we still have that bodily injury or attempted bodily injury, we have to show that tied interstate commerce. Again, I don't want to get technical with respect to the limitations, but I just want to give an indication of the types of cases that we pursue and the limitations we do have in doing them. That said, if we can't bring a case federally because we can't make one of these elements, we can't show that there was any tie to interstate commerce, we can't show that, well, that's the main one for our federal purposes, or there wasn't some specific federal statute that was violated, we can still work with the local law enforcement to provide them resources, because the state hate crimes statutes are broader and they can reach conduct that we can't. And when that occurs, and that's happened including in the case that Bob mentioned, our office has actually tried to coordinate and provide resources to state and local district attorneys to provide them the means and tools to still pursue these types of cases, even if we can't make a federal case out of it.
Okay, well, we've talked a little bit about what we do, the scope of the problem, the tools that we have available. Now we want to kind of start wrapping things up by talking about what we've done. I've said, and Todd has said, and other speakers have said, that the FBI and the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office here locally take hate crime very seriously. I think the numbers would bear that out. Since 9/11, a horrific event, a dark day in American history, but also a very dark day for spawning a new wave of anti-Muslim hate crime. Since that date, the FBI has conducted more than 800 investigations of anti-Muslim bias incidents. 800 investigations.
Is that in the United States or in California?
In the United States.
In the United States.
In addition to our own investigations, we have also assisted with more than 150 state and local investigations. As Todd mentioned, the federal government is not always the remedy for a hate incident, but the state and local governments do have remedies that aren't available to us. We have a lot of resources at the FBI and at the Department of Justice, and we will bring those resources to bear wherever it will help. We've had this year some successes across the country. In New York, there was a successful conclusion to a rather long-term investigation involving threats against an employee of CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. An unknown subject was making anonymous threats. Our FBI New York office opened an investigation, identified the subject, and within the last 12 months, that person was finally sentenced. We had another successful case in our Kansas City office. In Missouri, several individuals had defaced a mosque, and they had actually used spray paint and they desecrated a Quran on the steps of the mosque. Our Kansas City office opened an investigation. It identified the subjects, and within the last 12 months, we had successful sentencing of one of those subjects who was an adult. The other person was a minor, but the adult was charged with, among other things, the conspiracy statute that Todd mentioned. I could go on, but I would be remiss if I did not give at least one example from the Sacramento office. Now, of course, I cannot talk about pending investigations or investigations that are currently being prosecuted. So I wanted to give you an example that's actually a rather dated case, but I still think it's pertinent. This is a case involving an incident that took place in Madera, California, which is about 150 miles to the south east of us, at the Masjid Madera. On August 18th and August 24th in 2010, an unknown individual vandalized the Masjid Madera, mainly with signs. But on the 18th, this person also threw a brick at the mosque. He was intending to smash a window, but he actually ended up only doing relatively superficial damage. Nevertheless, I talked about the impact of hate crimes on a community. This was a deeply unsettling event. As we said, the FBI is many places, but we're not everywhere. Fortunately, we do have law enforcement partners that are aware of our interests, so we received a referral from the Madera County Sheriff's Office, and we opened a case rather early on. We did, in this, at the beginning, we didn't have a subject, but we did what we do best, and that is conducting a thorough, logical investigation. We identified all the places where attacks took place. We interviewed all the witnesses we could find. We did neighborhood canvasses, and of course, we did our CSI work. We worked with the Madera County Sheriff's Office to collect the evidence. We had the signs, we had the brick, we had the fragments of the Molotov cocktail. We sent those to the lab. Lo and behold, we got a fingerprint. We got actually a partial print, which identified a potential subject, Donnie Eugene Maurer. Now, a partial print is great. That certainly narrowed the focus of our investigation, but we're not about to go out and arrest somebody based upon a print. That guy could have thrown something out in the garbage used by this man. We would be arresting an innocent man. So, of course, we had a lot more work to do. And we did that work. We did surveillance. We did our records checks. We collected information using the grand jury. We did everything we needed to do. And we finally had enough information to confront Mr. Maurer, which we did on 3 occasions. On the first occasion, we did an interview on January 12th, 2011, and we got a partial confession. He admitted to being involved in making some of the signs, but he still held back. He wasn't going to admit that he actually put the signs up or threw the cocktail. We did a second interview a week later where we got a little bit more information. We still didn't get a full confession, however. 2 days later, he actually came to us, and he finally told us everything. So at that point, we did have enough to present the case officially and formally to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Of course, they were working with us the whole time, but at that point, our evidence collection largely stopped. And as you can see from the bottom half, if you can squint and read that from the back, a complaint was sworn out by an FBI agent 2 months later, and the day after that, on March 9th, 2011, we were able to arrest the subject. He pled guilty in October, was sentenced in January 2012. He received a sentence of 5 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. This happened ages and ages ago, but I actually looked him up. He was released 3 months ago, but rest assured, he is on supervised release until 2018. He was also ordered to pay $26,000 in restitution. Now, it's an interesting little case. I wanted to share it with you to kind of give you an idea of some of the things that we do in hate crimes investigations, but I also wanted to make a point that the FBI doesn't do it alone. That case started with a referral from a local sheriff's office in Madera County. And even though I kind of made that the FBI story, throughout that investigation, we were working hand in hand with the local sheriff's office. We can't do our job alone, especially outside of Sacramento City. Here, we've actually got fairly good manpower, but in our resident agencies, we are a little bit thin on the ground, and we rely heavily on our partners. There's also just one more quick point I want to make with this. This is a point, I was talking with my daughter about this case. She's like, Dad, why did this take you so long? Well, my daughter has grown up loving these police procedurals where everything happens in 1 hour, from incident to sentencing. Unfortunately, we have to be extraordinarily meticulous in making our cases. One, we want to make sure that if our subject is guilty, that we don't do something, leave out some piece of evidence that will make Todd's job incredibly difficult in the stand. And two, we don't want to jam somebody up who wasn't ultimately responsible. We don't want to go after an innocent person and subject that person to the rigors of the judicial process. That partial print, yes, that was a clue, but that was in many ways the start of the investigation, not the conclusion of it.
And just to reiterate that, oftentimes our office will get called, and we don't ultimately take a case because, in California at least, there are many tools that are available to the state and local DAs. That said, we're still there all the way, and we're there in case something goes wrong with respect to the state prosecution. We have additional resources that we can bring to bear. We have the FBI, and the FBI actually will sometimes help with state prosecutions, even though they don't ultimately go to our office. And it's an important feature of what we do. And it's also important that to the extent that at any point people in the community feel like they're not getting a sufficient response from the state or local agencies, we are also here to provide that as a reception to that situation. I can't say that we're going to step in and come to a different conclusion than may have been reached by state or local agencies, but we are also able to take fresh eyes and a fresh look at situations. The flip side is we're also there as a first line of defense, and we utilize the fact that the state often has resources on the ground at all times that can be very important in our federal prosecution going forward.
We have just one more slide that we want to conclude on. I'll let Todd speak to this. About this, I just want to really address the bottom point, because this is one of the most important things that I have learned over my career in law enforcement, which started back in, it's recently for some folks I work with, 98. One thing that I've learned is that effective policing and effective investigations is based on trust with the community. I cannot do my job without the trust of the people out there that I have to deal with. I talked a little bit about the underreporting problem with hate crime. That's a symptom of it. And it's something that I try to do when I address folks like you. I do try to hand out my cards. I do try to talk with people. And I think my agency is trying to do that as well. In the past, perhaps this wasn't as important and it wasn't as high a priority as it should have been. But I hope that you can understand that we really do value it today. And I hope going forward that it's as, if not more important.
And I just want to end with hopefully reiterating, although it may be for the first time hearing for some people, that our office takes incredibly seriously these types of incidents. We have a situation that you need to express to our office. You should do so without hesitation, without fear that somehow that's going to lead to some sort of magnifying glass or switching the observations to the community, and that's not it. Our office and me and every one of the other prosecutors I know and work with take incredibly seriously our responsibilities and obligations to ensure that every person who is within this district and beyond is entitled to the same level of protection under the federal statutes that we can bring. And that's something we hold very dear. It's our mission, the Department of Justice. That's what we do, and we try to do it every day. And I appreciate the fact that we're able to come to this community and at least continue this dialogue. And I hope it kind of pays dividends going forward. So I'm sure there are some questions. If we can field those, or even afterwards, we're more than happy to do so. Yes, well, and a lot of it is it's not just whether or not someone actually is transgendered, but it's also the perception that someone may be transgendered, but that's what gender identity would be. Yes.
Can that be balanced a little bit?
It's a complicated question because this comes up at two stages. One, if we start an investigation and somehow it gets out that we've identified a person of interest, and we do our investigation and we end up, that person is not charged, there's no kind of formal mechanism to exonerate or absolve that person. This is something that the FBI became very well aware of during our Amerithrax investigation. So that's one complication. The other complication is what happens if somebody is charged and goes through the judicial process and is found not guilty. That there actually are, mechanisms for publicizing that. Regarding the former, I don't have a good answer for you, but regarding the latter, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I can't necessarily address that specifically, other than, certainly our office, when our office brings charges, in many cases, not all, we may advise the press and the public of the fact that charges have been brought. And part of that is because we think an important function of what we do is informing the public of the types of cases we're bringing to provide transparency so the public knows essentially what we believe are priorities within our office. That said, we try to stress every time we address the press or the public that when the charges are initially being brought, there is a presumption of innocence that the charged person has, and that carries throughout the judicial proceedings until that person pleads guilty or is found guilty by the jury. And at least our office takes very seriously the fact that every person is entitled to a fair trial, and we don't try to at all, other than alert the public to the nature of the charges, go into the nature of the evidence. I understand your point, however, at the end of the day, if the person is somehow the charges are dismissed or at least found not guilty, there's been an acquittal, that's something that probably doesn't get as much press, and perhaps the way to identify those issues is to better address to the media why isn't that being covered. I can tell you that from the perspective of our office bringing charges, the national origin, ethnicity, religion of the defendant is not something that our office considers at all. I know every single prosecutor in my office, and I have no question that is not a consideration. I don't doubt that is not a consideration any person in our office ever has. And to the extent that the public or the media somehow is fixating upon that, I do think that's something that dialogue needs to continue with, and hopefully the media can become more advised to avoiding the sensationalism of those kinds of situations.
I completely understand that is a dialogue.
So our office also fields complaints directly. We have, obviously, if you were to call our main number and indicated you wanted to speak to someone about a potential hate crime, our office often would direct the call to me because that's one of the positions I have. Or we have federal prosecutors who are on duty each and every week, and so if I'm not available, there is someone there to field a call. And what will happen, honestly, is if we get the information, likely I'm calling up Bob and saying, we just got this complaint, can you please contact this person so we can pursue it? So that it can come in through us, it can come in through FBI, but ultimately we're going to address it in hopefully the same way. So as Sean just mentioned, it gets a little tricky. We can't necessarily provide advice in advance as to whether or not something's legal or illegal. All we can do is take the information, and then oftentimes if someone's raising a complaint, we can inform the person that we've looked into it and we've concluded that there's not going to be any further federal investigation. We can advise at least to the conclusion of the nature of the investigation. We can't go into the details usually of our analysis. If you're the complaining, if you're the person bringing the investigation, if you're the victim, you're entitled to certain rights and certain level of information that perhaps we're not going to give to the general public. What we're not going to do is tell you, well, we just went and talked to these 4 people, and here's what they told us. We are going to keep the details of the investigation confidential until such time as a charge is brought, and if it's not brought, we may advise you simply that we're done, and that's it. And I know it can be very awkward and sometimes frustrating for people that they want to know what happened and why, and we can't always explain that other than hopefully just through these kind of events, advising the public as to what it is we can prosecute and what are the limits of our federal prosecution. And certainly, as I've mentioned, if we reach the conclusion we can't prosecute something federally, but we do believe a crime has been committed, then we will oftentimes then reach out to the state and local law enforcement and try to get them on board to see if they can pursue justice where we just can't because we're limited by our federal jurisdiction.
And that's also something that the FBI does for the complaints that we receive. If it's clear to us that there's not a federal violation, I'll make an effort to notify the person who made the complaint. It's something that we are not doing consistently due to resources, either in Sacramento or across the Bureau, but it's something that we are working on. It really, based upon the statistics that I've reviewed, it really depends upon the nature of the bias. For hate crimes, for example, anti-gay hate crimes, the overwhelming number of victims are male. But it just varies depending upon the bias. There are statistics, and I have them back in my office, but I just don't have them at the top of my head. One place I would recommend you go for an answer, though. Oh. There are actually two places that you can go online to get more detailed information. One is, I mentioned, the Criminal Justice Information Services Division, CJIS. If you Google CGIS and then also UCR, Uniform Crime Report, that will take you to the page that has all of our national statistics. And if you Google hate crime and California Department of Justice, you'll get the most recent Cal DOJ report on there.
Thank you very much.